I now call to order the Society's 2,442nd meeting in the 150th year since its founding on March 13, 1871. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to PSW Science's Spring 2021 meeting and lecture series. Because of COVID-19, the Society is bringing this meeting to you via Zoom from locations all around the globe rather than our usual home, the John Wesley Powell Auditorium of the Cosmos Club in Washington, D.C. Our speaker tonight is Carlo Rovelli, Director of the Quantum Gravity Group at the Center for Theoretical Physics in Marseille, France, Distinguished Visiting Research Chair at the Perimeter Institute. He will be speaking on quantum gravity and approaches to unifying general relativity with quantum mechanics. I'm Larry Milstein, President and Program Director of PSW Science, one of the oldest scientific societies of Washington, D.C., founded in 1871 as the Philosophical Society of Washington, to provide a forum to exchange scientific ideas, further scientific understanding, and encourage scientific inquiry. This lecture is being recorded and will be posted to the PSW Science YouTube channel, where it will join over 160 other recordings of PSW Science lectures. We invite you to explore these presentations and, if you like what you find, to become a PSW member and to subscribe to the PSW channels on YouTube and Vimeo, as well as to PSW on Twitter and Facebook. The Society is grateful for the sponsorship of the 2020-2021 lecture series by the Policy Studies Organization in cooperation with the American Public University and by a generous donor who was asked to remain anonymous. We are also grateful to the sponsors of this evening's meeting, PSW member Carl Merrill. Thank you, Carl. And the IP law firm of Mill & White, Solano & Brannigan. Please join me in thanking all PSW sponsors. Tonight's lecture is the 90th annual Joseph Henry Lecture, honoring Joseph Henry. Henry founded the Society and was its first president, serving in that role from its founding in 1871 until his untimely death 7 years later in 1878. He is still the longest serving president of the Society. Henry was the most accomplished American physicist of his time, and also America's most widely known scientist. He is best known for his contributions to understanding electricity and magnetism, particularly for his findings on electromagnetic induction, by means of which a powerful magnetic field can be induced by flowing a current through an insulator conductor wound around a ferrite core. His work allowed the production of powerful magnets that could be turned on and off at will, and led directly to the invention of the telegraph and the telephone. In fact, Henry developed early versions of the telegraph and consulted with Samuel B. Morse, who invented the telegraph system that ultimately was widely adopted. Henry's work similarly led to the invention of the telephone by Alexander Graham Bell, who fittingly made his first demonstration of the telephone in Washington, D.C. before PSW, then known by its full name, the Philosophical Society of Washington. In recognition of his seminal contributions, the standard unit of induction is named the Henry. And the spiral symbol of induction is a prominent feature of the PSW logo, seen at the top of the slide, and it adorns the sides of the PSW ribbon worn by many PSW members. Henry was a tireless promoter of science, as well as a leading American scientist of the times. He took on many responsibilities in science organizations. Among these, in addition to founding and serving as PSW's first president, Henry was founding secretary of the Smithsonian Institution. Henry died unexpectedly while he was still a vital part of the nation's scientific community. His death was headline news around the world, quite an accolade when the country had few prominent scientists with international reputations. And the Capitol closed down entirely in mourning. We honor Henry and his legacy with the annual Joseph Henry Lectures on important topics in science that would certainly have interested him. And we honor Henry today also by using the Society's ceremonial gavel, carved from the timbers of the White House, used for the reconstruction of 1815 to 1817, after the British, those of the famously special relationship, burned it to the ground in the War of 1812. The wood from that reconstruction was recovered during the Truman Reconstruction of 1949 to 1952. Time can heal all wounds, and we use the gavel today in the spirit of Joseph Henry's devotion to science, his accomplishments, and the promise of the scientific enterprise to bring about a peaceable and a better life for all. Before we turn to the lecture, in keeping with the Society's traditions, we will welcome new members and read the minutes of the previous meeting and the summary of the previous meeting's lecture. I am pleased to announce that the following new members have been elected to the Society. Ravi Deepak, a principal with STC Corporation, interested in earth and environmental science, physics, space and astrobiology, nanotechnology, and science policy. Learned of PSW from family members and from attending PSW meetings, both in person and on Zoom and on YouTube. Keith Farris, a microbiologist with the MITRE Corporation, interested in microbiology, genetics, cell biology, and health sciences, who learned of PSW from a PSW member. Catherine Morris, an attorney with the Army, interested in earth sciences, who learned of PSW from Eventbrite and has attended PSW lectures. And Carlo Ravelli, our speaker tonight, who learned of PSW through our invitation to speak, whose interests are far-ranging and include classics, the philosophy and history of science, and the subject of tonight's talk, fundamental physics and the unification of quantum mechanics with general relativity. Please join me in welcoming them to membership. Welcome. PSW is a membership organization, and a participatory membership is central to PSW's mission of communicating and furthering science. I encourage everyone with an interest in science to become a member. It's easy to do using the PSW website. Go to the home page, www.pswscience.org. Click on the blue join button at the upper right-hand corner and follow the prompts. PSW is a 501c3 charitable education and professional organization. Dues payments and other donations are tax deductible. Recording Secretary James Heelan will now read the minutes of the 2441st meeting and the lecture by Bill Powell on bringing back the American chestnut tree using biotechnology. James, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Larry. Good evening, everyone. On May 21st, 2021, by Zoom webinar broadcast on the PSW Science YouTube channel, President Milstein called the 2,441st meeting of the Society to order at 8:02 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. He welcomed new members, and the recording secretary read the minutes of the previous meeting. President Milstein then introduced the speaker for the evening, Bill Powell, Professor of Environmental Sciences and Forestry at the State University of New York, and Director of the American Chestnut Research and Restoration Project. His lecture was titled, Bringing Back the American Chestnut Tree, How Biotechnology Can Be Applied to Conservation. In the 19th century, there were over 3 billion American chestnut trees in eastern North America, comprising approximately 25% of the trees in the Appalachian Mountains. Among the largest trees in the eastern forests, American chestnuts were widely used for woodworking, food and beer production, and medicinal purposes. Animals, from bees to bears, also relied on the American chestnut. In the early 20th century, Asian chestnut trees were imported into the United States and brought with them Cryophaenectria parasitica. American chestnut trees were vulnerable to the invasive fungus and died off in droves. Within 50 years, the blight killed approximately 4 billion American chestnut trees in the eastern United States. Because the fungus continues to survive on oak trees, Powell said it prevents a natural American chestnut resurgence. Yet, despite the blight, American chestnut trees are not extinct. Rootstock continues to survive across the American forests because the blight cannot compete with the microorganisms in soil. These roots at times go through a Sisyphean cycle of sprouting, becoming infected with blight, and dying back again. During the Great Die-Off, public efforts to defeat the blight included fungicides, removing infected trees, replacing American chestnut trees with non-native timber-type chestnut trees from China, gamma and X-ray mutagenesis, and hypervirulence. Continuing efforts include species hybrid breeding, back cross breeding of hybrids, and genetic engineering. Powell said chestnut hybrids are suitable for ornamental and crop purposes, but not for restoration. Hybrid chestnut trees are prone to reduced growth, male sterility, cracked bark, and loss of desired traits in future generations. These problems can be managed in an agricultural setting, but are fatal to restoration in the wild. In 1983, the American Chestnut Foundation began with a hybrid and back-crossed it with pure American chestnuts through several generations to select for the American phenotype with the blight resistance of Asian species. Since then, the Foundation's efforts have only produced American chestnut phenotypes with intermediate blight resistance. Chestnut has approximately 30,000 gene pairs. Genetic engineering allows scientists to begin with an American chestnut tree and add only genetic coding for blight resistance. When the blight enters a tree wound, it forms an individual hyphae in the wound and lives off dead material. Both the American and Chinese chestnut will respond by laying down a lignified zone to try and wall off the fungus. The trees will then form vascular tissue and slough off the canker. But in susceptible trees, the fungus forms micellar fans that excrete acids and break through the lignified barrier. Some trees have developed the ability to release oxalate oxidase, polygalactorinase inhibiting proteins, and lacase-like genes to counter the blight's attacks. Powell described the various resistance genes scientists have investigated and selected for encoding into American chestnut trees. He said these efforts are currently in early stages. Lacases have been shown to increase resistance in plants like cotton by increasing lignification. Lacases are similar in both American and Chinese chestnut, but Chinese chestnut expresses them tenfold. Powell said scientists are now exploring methods like CRISPR to encode genetic promoters from the Chinese species into the American chestnut to enhance lacase expression. Scientists are currently working on the gene that encodes the oxalate oxidase enzyme. While the non-gluten, non-allergen enzyme is found in many food crops, Powell's organization is focused on the wheat variety. If successful, the American chestnut will be able to detoxify oxalic acid and fend off the blight without killing the fungus. Powell then described the agrobacterium process for inserting genes into individual cells. His team has shortened the process to 12 months, from transformation to a potted American chestnut plant. Because genes are inserted semi-randomly into a chromosome, scientists need to test numerous events to identify optimal results. Scientists then use leaf and stem assays to assess blight resistance. To begin outcrossing resistant trees, Powell's team uses a light chamber to induce flowering in transgenic trees to pollinate wild-type American chestnuts. They have so far proven that oxalate oxidase is passed to offspring. Powell then addressed the EPA, USDA, and FDA regulatory framework and the minimal adverse environmental impact of his work. Powell is optimistic that genetic engineering will facilitate restoring the American chestnut in the wild. He sees planting in mine reclamation sites, historic sites, and on private land to initiate a 100-year process to restore the American chestnut to the wild. After the question and answer period, President Milstein thanked the speaker, made the usual housekeeping announcements, and invited guests to join the society. President Milstein adjourned the meeting at 9:56 p.m. Temperature in Washington, D.C., 26 degrees Celsius. Weather, sunny. Concurrent viewers on the Zoom and YouTube live stream, 51, and views on the PSW Science YouTube and Vimeo channels, 245. Respectfully submitted, James Heelan, Recording Secretary.
Thank you, James. The minutes will be posted to the website in due course. Please send any corrections or comments on the minutes to Corresponding Secretary Robin Taylor at correspondingsec@pswscience.org. A video of the lecture is available for everyone without charge on the PSW Science YouTube channel, the PSW Science Vimeo channel, and it can be accessed directly from the PSW Science website. We now turn to tonight's lecture and the 90th Annual Joseph Henry Lecturer. It's my pleasure to introduce Carlo Rovelli, Distinguished Professor of Physics and Director of the Quantum Gravity Group at Marseille University in France, Adjunct Professor of Philosophy at the University of Western Ontario, and Distinguished Visiting Research Chair at the Perimeter Institute. Carlo works on one of the great unsolved problems in modern physics, the unification of general relativity with quantum mechanics. One focus of his work has been the formulation and development of the theory of loop quantum gravity and observable consequences of that theory. The second focus has been the statistical behavior of gravity and the nature of time. In this work, Carlo and Elaine Canis have developed the concept of thermal time. A third focus has been the relational interpretation of quantum theory, which Carlo sees as, quote, the least implausible of the ways of understanding the theory, close quote. Carlo is an author on more than 275 technical papers on his research and the author of 2 authoritative technical texts on loop quantum gravity. In addition, he is the author of several non-technical books on physics and the history of science, including 7 brief lessons on physics, now translated into 44 languages, The Order of Time, Reality is Not What It Seems, Helgoland, named for the island where Heisenberg first formulated quantum mechanics, and a book on the first scientist, Anaximander. Among many other honors and awards, Carlo has been named one of the 100 most influential global thinkers by Foreign Policy. Carlo studied classics in Italian secondary school, then earned his BS plus MS equivalent at the University of Bologna and his PhD equivalent in physics at the University of Padova. All questions will be fielded in the question and answer period after the lecture. Carlo, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you to all of you for being here. It's a pleasure, enormous, and it's a honor. And I do not hide that being the 90th lecture, and the 442nd meeting of the PSW is quite impressive, even for an Italian like me, where the National Academy in physics, the Accademia dei Lincei, was founded by Galileo himself and his friends. I consider it an honor. So let me also thank my neighbor who lent me a jacket for the opportunity, and my girlfriend who cut my hair a few hours ago. I will not complain, Larry, for the attribution of the invention of the telephone to Bell instead of Meucci. And this is enough for my national pride. And we can go to science, where national pride plays no role, and to quantum gravity. Quantum gravity has been the main theme of my work. All the rest has going around it. And I have decided to take this opportunity of this lecture in the spirit of these lectures to exchange scientific ideas, to tell where I think we are on the general problem of quantum gravity. Instead of taking this as an opportunity to present the last bit of last week work that might become obsolete in another week or month, I want to try to give an overview of where I think we are in this extraordinary beautiful problem, which is quantum gravity. Where is loop quantum gravity situated with respect to various possible approaches to quantum gravity, and why I think it is interesting. These are my slides. So the short title is Quantum Gravity, Where Are We? And what I'm going to do is to give you the central part of my talk will be a short bird view of loop quantum gravity. Of course, very synthetic, because this is a work of hundreds of people in 30, 40 years, books and thousands of papers. But I want to zoom on what are the main achievements and why I think it is interesting. But before and after that, I want to just focus on what exactly is the problem of quantum gravity, and emphasize the fact that it is strictly related to empirical science, to observations. And recently, a number of empirical observations have been relevant for quantum gravity and are helping us in zooming in toward the problem. I want to sort of dissipate a common idea that quantum gravity, it's a mathematical game rather than something deeply rooted in empirical science. That empirical science is what nourish the utility and the reasonableness of science. And then after that, after talking about loop quantum gravity, the third part, it's the magic of quantum gravity, I want to comment on the conceptual implications of a theory of quantum gravity, which are deep, and they're probably what makes the problem of quantum gravity interesting, which can be seen as coming out from the theory itself, but have in these decades been the true source of development of the theory. I mean, the difficulty of the theory, like the difficulty of many other major steps in physics, is not just to play with mathematics, is to find the right conceptual structure for thinking ahead. And the non-perturbative approaches to quantum gravity have been characterized by the attention to these problems, and have built on the attention of these problems. I'll put this not up front, but at the end, because after all, loop quantum gravity, we don't know if it is right or wrong, because we don't have a body of supporting evidence of the theory, like we have for the established theory, but it's a quantum theory of gravity. So in a sense, it's a proof of existence of the possibility of having a quantum theory of gravity. And therefore, it answers the conceptual problem. It provides an answer of the conceptual problems, which were so hard in moving toward the construction of the theory, and I'll say why. So, into business, why quantum gravity? And I'll start wide, because often the problem of quantum gravity is confused with similar problems that physicists are addressing. Let me start by a simple observation, okay? What do we know about the physical world at the elementary level? We know quantum mechanics, which has never been proven wrong in 100 years. We know the standard model of particle physics, which continually turn out to be right, in spite of the fact that every other week we hear, oh, we have hints that it's wrong, but we have had hints that it is wrong for half a century, since the 70s. And so far, all the hints have disappeared. So one day we'll find something wrong, but we haven't yet. And we have general relativity, which has been confirmed in a spectacular way, especially in the last years, with gravitational waves, the picture of black holes, and cosmology, and else, and which has slowly eliminated empirically a number of alternative theories that have been considered in the meanwhile, and continuously turn out to be the right theory. This is what we know: quantum mechanics, the standard model, general relativity. Everything else that you hear from me and from my colleagues is speculations. That may be right, that may be wrong. It's attempt, it's stones thrown into the blue without knowing whether hitting or not. And in fact, I want to emphasize one point, which is the great empirical results, observation and experiments in the last decades. Number of Nobel Prizes, led the number of Nobel Prizes, the Higgs, the ones I mentioned, gravitational wave, black holes, cosmology, but also others like entanglement verified at distance of hundreds of kilometers, and so many other things. These are all beautiful, marvelously beautiful results, but are not novelties with respect to our fundamental theories. They're just confirmations of things that is studied at the university in the 70s, right? So nature, for half a century, has told us those theories that you developed 100 years ago or half a century ago, these are right. They continue to be right, in spite of the hope of everybody of finding them wrong. Now, of course, there are things we don't know, and we may think that we can do better. The standard model, it's considered, has been considered from the very beginning, ugly patchwork with too many free constant. It's not a unified theory. The standard model is a patchwork of theories. There were indications that it should go wrong at some energies. This indication turned out to be wrong. So use of naturalness to argue that certain physics should appear a certain energy turned out to be wrong. But still, particle physicists continue to view the standard model with enormous suspicion, whether it's justified or not. And so justifiably, a lot of people try to study physics beyond the standard model, and has been doing so for decades without so far producing any predictions that nature has said yes. In fact, producing all sorts of predictions that nature has said no. There is a part of the fundamental physics theoretical community that dreams of a theory of everything, to quote a famous book, namely dreams of writing a single equation that explains everything, single theory from which all the rest comes out, a single entity that contains in itself as manifestation all the other things. We're very far from that. Even the standard model itself, it's not a unified theory. The strong interactions are not unified with the electroweak interaction. Fantastically beautiful attempt of unification, like SU5 theory, were just wrong because they predicted proton decay at a scale that did not come out. But the dream of a unified theory is motivating a lot of my colleagues, and is a dream of unification. It's a noble dream. We might have the tools for doing it. We might not. Einstein thought he could do it, but he clearly did not have the tools. He did not even knew there were strong interaction and weak interaction, or he didn't care about the already indications of those. for the moment, the attempt to do a theory of everything, a convincing theory of everything that convinces everybody, are not very successful yet. There are things which definitely are very puzzling out there empirically. We almost are without phenomena that contradict openly the theories that I mentioned before, but some might be. And in particular, dark matter is a strong phenomenology that seems to be hard to understand in terms of the theories mentioned before, even if it's not ruled out yet, and I'll come back to that. So these are, well, we might do better, but then in the theories we have, there is a clear hole, something which certainly is something we don't know, which is the quantum properties of gravity. The gravitational field is a field, like electromagnetic field, like the strong interaction fields, like other fields of fundamental physics. We have all reason to believe that it satisfies, it behaves quantum mechanically in the appropriate regime. We do not have a theory of its quantum mechanical behavior, which means that we cannot compute what happens in the regimes, in the part of the universe where quantum mechanical behavior is expected. For instance, in the early universe, for instance, inside the black holes, for instance, at the end of the Hawking evaporation of a black hole, and just for instance, in a very small scale, whatever depend on very small scale. These are things we don't know. We genuinely do not know because we do not have a quantum theory of gravity. So this is the problem of quantum gravity. And I want to stress this because the problem of quantum gravity is not the problem of the unification of all the forces. Is not the problem of going beyond the standard model, justifying the standard model. Is not, necessarily the problem of dark matter. Is just a problem that we understand the quantum property of electromagnetism, photons, for instance. We understand the quantum property of the weak interactions. They play a role in we compute probabilities for radioactive decay. We do not understand the quantum properties of gravity, and we have all reason to believe that they are there. Now, this seems simple. The complications come, and the beauty come, because of the specific feature of what we know about gravity, which is the fact, let me be careful here, because I think this is a good perspective for thinking about quantum gravity. The fact that the gravitational field has a peculiarity, namely some aspect of the gravitational field are what we usually call the geometry of space and the geometry of time, namely the kind of things that a rod measure and a clock measure. And let me be precise here, because space and time means all sorts of things. Conceptual clarity is the point, is the name of the game here. Space and time means different things. For instance, space means where I am, and where I am, I'm near this screen. I am in London. When am I? I am 1, 2, 3, 4 days. Where and when can be used just for to locate things with respect to their surrounding. But we use space and time in a much more precise and focused way, which was introduced by Newton, which is to assume, that was Newton's assumption, that there is actually something out there, which is there even if there is nothing, which is a space, which has a geometrical structure, and time passes even if nothing, there's no event to count, which is a passing of time. This Newtonian space and this Newtonian time evolved in Einstein's special relativistic Minkowski space-time, which plays a major role in physics in our understanding of the world, where this Minkowski space-time, Einstein understood 10 years later that is nothing else that a feature of the gravitational field, when you disregard its not only its quantum properties, but its dynamical property altogether. So therefore, a quantum theory of gravity is a quantum theory of space-time in this sense. And that's what makes the problem interesting. Now, quantum gravity is quantum theory of space and quantum theory of time. And quantum theory means all the typical phenomena of quantum theory, like quantum superposition, the Schrödinger cat that can be asleep and awake at the same time, or the electron that can go through holes at the same time. Namely quantum interference, more precisely. It means quantum fuzziness, if you have a rotating thing has an angular momentum of 3 components, if it is small, the 3 components cannot be all 3 sharp together because they don't commute. So they're always fuzzy in the small. You can at most diagonalize 2. And quantum discreteness. Quantum discreteness is a major feature of quantum mechanics. In fact, she's the one that gives the name to the theory. It is ubiquitous, right? The electromagnetic waves arrives on a screen in little dots, the photons. The energy levels of an atom are discrete. The angular momentum is discrete. You do Stern-Gerlach, you have only two dots on the, or discrete dots on the screen instead of a line, how you would expect. So discreteness is ubiquitous in quantum mechanics. And you expect quantum superposition of space-time, fuzziness of geometry, and some sort of quantum discreteness of geometry just before the gravity is quantized. So this is what is the problem and what we expect from the problem. What do we know to solve the problem? Well, we know quantum mechanics and we know general relativity. It's enormous amount of knowledge because to write a theory coherent with quantum mechanics and coherent with general relativity, namely that in the right regime, in the semi-classical regime, the classical regime gives back general relativity, it's a hard problem. It has taken decades. It's we don't have all sorts of theories. We're very, very few theories that can come close to doing that. But it's a sort of well-defined problem in this way, right? I mean, can you write quantum theory, Hilbert space, operators, just whatever formalism of quantum theory you like better, such that in the classical limit, we sort of know what is a classical limit of a theory, you get general relativity? That's the question. And a well-defined theory, a theory you can compute with. And of course, the conventional method that we use to go from a classical theory, when you know the classical limit, to guess the quantum theory, which are called quantization, a strange name, don't work in gravity. Otherwise, the problem would have been solved in the 30s when people started to think about that. The first people who thought about that is back in the 30s, because the reason you can do has to do with very short scale, with ultraviolet. You get this so-called ultraviolet divergences, namely the theory produces infinities in a way that cannot be controlled. Now, how to address this? Well, all sorts of ways. This is a slide which I'm not going to comment, which lists approaches to quantum gravity. And if you look at this, or you just look at titles in the literature, you say, oh my God! I mean, we are going everywhere and nowhere. It's total confusion. But that's not really the situation in quantum gravity, because the list of approaches to quantum gravity, so if you go on Wikipedia, there is a list of approaches to quantum gravity. There are more than the ones I've listed here. First of all, many of them are connected. They're just different aspects of the same thing. Many of them are not quantum gravity. They have some possible connection to quantum gravity. Many of them are just classical theories that, works there, saying might be better for doing quantum gravity. But even cutting away all these and all the many which are highly incomplete, so you can compute anything, so they're not theories, they're sketches of theory, or some little group or some little person going in some strange direction, which there's nothing wrong about it, right? Einstein was a little person who was going in a strange direction, and he was right and everybody else was wrong. So when he did general relativity. So it might come out from, who knows, the answer to the problem of quantum gravity. But it hasn't so far from small approaches. On the other hand, there are large communities that work on attempts to, well-developed attempt to write a quantum theory of gravity. And these are maybe 2 or 3 or 4, depend how you count, and go in different directions. They, add to our knowledge hypotheses like supersymmetry, high dimension, strings, infinite number of other stuff that we haven't seen, or breaking Lorentz invariance, or assuming that quantum mechanics is actually wrong and trying to change it. There's a small number of approaches that just stay in the problem, so to say, ask whether, which might be the wrong question, but ask whether we can just write a quantum theory whose classical limit is GR, instead of mixing other problem in, and which might help solve the quantum gravity problem, or might just be a distraction. And these can be divided still into groups. Those that assume that there are infinite degrees of freedom in the small, and those who either assume or derive that this infinite number of degrees of freedom in the small that give rise to the ultraviolet divergences, for one reason or the others, are not there. I'll come back to that. But, and this is where I wanted to get at in this first part of my talk, and then I go to quantum gravity, to loop quantum gravity. We know much more than that, and much more than that and has happened in the last years. Let me take an example. There were theories like Ojava-Litzwitz theory here that, 100,000 papers were published 10 years ago, great enthusiasm, because by breaking Lorentz invariants, assuming something's basically wrong in what we know about the universe, it seems to be easier to control the divergences. So this prompted a empirical search, because this is science. If Lorentz invariance is broken at the Planck scale, that's where you need to break it to have to control the divergences, then we may test it. And in fact, it's not so hard to test it because there are many ways of measuring high energies, not just smashing particles one against the other one like we do in the particle accelerators, which only arrive at TeV, certainly not at Planck energy. We have information about nature of much, much higher energy. I mentioned SU5 before, ruled out by proton decay. This is a phenomenon at 3 orders of magnitude from the Planck scales, much, much higher energy. There are other ways of getting information about that energy. And in astrophysics, there are ways of checking for violation of, so breaking the Lorentz invariance at Planck scale. So this prompted a large campaign in astrophysical observations. The result of this, in sort of 10 years of observation, is that all the phenomenon that were hypothesized, that would break Lorentz invariance at the Planck scale have not been seen. Namely, bound were put on dimensionless parameter controlling them, sometimes extraordinarily small, 10 to the minus 20, 10 to the minus 20, 14, etc., etc. This is an old reference, but this is even stronger now. So Lorentz violating approaches to quantum gravity are a little bit in a difficulty because of observations. Observations are putting strong constraint on the idea that the solution could be there. And let me make a point for continuing, a general point on philosophy of science, because this, I think, is a conceptual confusion that plagues a little bit theoretical physics. Many theoretical physics thinks in Popperian terms. Everything which has not been falsified, it's possible. I think this is bad philosophy of science. That's not the way science works. Science doesn't work just falsifying theory. Science works de facto, historically, and when it's successful, in a far more nuanced way, which one can call a Bayesian way, by accumulating positive and negative element or negative elements in support of a theory. When you have a sufficient number of predictions of the theory, you start believing it, putting confidence in it, verified, you start putting confidence in it. When you are piling up predictions of the theory that are not verified, it's not that you kill the theory, because theories can be adapted, but your confidence level in the theory comes down. Let me make an example. Suppose I have a theory which there are giraffes in the woods of Canada, right? And I to check it, I go hiking in the woods of Canada, I don't see a giraffe. Okay, does this kill the theory? No, of course. I mean, the giraffe will just sit there. But if for 30 years, everybody who go hiking, okay, does not see, nobody who goes hiking see a giraffe, well, does this kill the theory? No, according to Popper, because, giraffes can be very small, very good in hiding, but nobody believes anymore that there are giraffes in the woods of Canada. I look carefully, there's a giraffe there. But giraffes in the woods of Canada have not been seen. So I want to mention that because a similar story to the giraffe has happened with supersymmetry. We have heard, well, maybe there are giraffes in the wood, maybe giraffes supersymmetric particles for 30 years. And for 30 years, they were maybe there, okay, just very good in hiding, very small, good in hiding, higher mass, like the giraffes. And a large community was convinced to find this supersymmetric particle at lab. and was very disappointed and seemed very strange, but strong arguments were put forward for saying that certainly at LHC, and I had a large number of colleagues who were 99.9% certain that LHC supersymmetry would come up, would appear. It did not, right? Does this falsifies the attempt to solve quantum gravity with supersymmetry? Supersymmetry helps a lot with quantum gravity because the infinities of the gravitons Feynman loops are cancelled by the infinities of corresponding supersymmetric particles, which tend to be the same but with an opposite sign. So naturally simplifies, makes the thing better. But supersymmetric particles have not seen where they were expected. And for the same reason for which, if we had seen them, it would not have proven the theory right, but it would have been strong additional confidence, would have been confirming the theory in the sense of increasing the Bayesian credence in the theory. The fact of not having seen it has decreased the Bayesian credency in the likelihood that the theory works. Another similar example has been the cosmological constant. Einstein wrote the Einstein equation in 1917 in this form, which is written here with two constants, the Newton constant, the cosmological constant. The Newton constant was known, has been measured long ago, and is still one of the worst measured constant, fundamental constant of physics. The cosmological constant is very small, and it has not been measured until not long ago, but the measurement of it is basically the Nobel Prize of these people here. Why I mention that? Because a large community assumed and strongly believed, motivated by the form of the theory on which they're working, that lambda had to be negative. And still now, the majority of the papers are published in models where lambda is negative. But lambda is positive, has been measured and is positive. Now, it's possible to make the giraffe very small and to reconcile approaches to quantum gravity that naturally leads to a negative lambda to a positive lambda, but definitely it does not look as a positive indication for these approaches. And there's a lot of confusion about lambda. I mean, for some strange reason, it's called the great mystery of dark energy. I don't think there's anything mysterious any more than other coupling constants in the standard model, like the Higgs mass, which have similar aspect about their renormalization problem that we don't understand. Then there are empirical evidence which we don't have yet, but on which there is a lot of work, theoretical work going on, observational work going on, trying to match theory with observation regarding the CMB, quantum gravity effect in the universe, black holes. I will mention this later on, so I don't want to go ahead. But I do want, before closing this introduction, which is taking me too long, I should have gone faster, I do want to mention some beautiful experiments that are being prepared, and I hope have been studied, and I hope they will be done in the next years, perhaps not 1, 2, but before I die, which are laboratory experiment to check the superposition of geometry. You can use gravity to entangle quantum split nanoparticles, and if gravity is not quantum, like some hypotheses to quantum gravity suggest, you could not entangle two particles with a mediator, which is gravity. So if, as it's impossible, it seems to be possible, the entanglement via gravity of quantum split nanoparticles or something analogous can be tested in the laboratory, this will be strong evidence that those directions are ruled out, I would say, or strongly, because you never ruled out, strongly unfavored by what nature is saying. So this is the situation. There are various theories, but most are incomplete. Some are in tension with empirical result. Some were promising a lot, right? Like string theory, were promising to compute all the parameters of the standard model in the 80s and just not delivering. There are not much available theory out there. There are some, more than one, but not available here. That was introduction, because I want to zoom on what I think is the best theory we have present for tentative theory, because we don't have any direct empirical evidence yet. So the dream of my life is, before I die, to see some hints that would sort of increase the credibility of the theory by confirming some predictions, which is loop quantum gravity. So here is the idea of loop quantum gravity. Forget about violation Lorentz invariance, forget about extra dimensions, forget about supersymmetry, forget about having to go at infinite distance and having bulk boundary stories. No additional hypothesis besides generativity and quantum mechanics. So where is the problem? Why the infinities? Because, and I will argue that in detail, the infinities of the naive quantization of quantum mechanics are based on the fact that in standard perturbation theory, we assume a fixed background geometry. Namely, we assume that the geometry is continuous all the way to infinity, while geometry itself, it's quantized. And as we will see, the discreteness of quantum mechanics tell us, and this is a non-perturbative calculation within the theory, that there is no infinite number of degrees of freedom in the small. So in other words, quantum theory, the discreteness of quantum theory, and the general relativistic fact that the metric is dynamical and therefore quantum, save quantum field theory from itself, from its own infinities. The theory was born by a surprise, which I need to mention here because it took 30 years to understand why this surprise. But the surprise was the following. Back in the 60s, when Wheeler and DeWitt wrote the Wheeler-DeWitt equation, this beautiful and useless equation here, useless because it's too complicated. It's a functional, it's a system of infinite coupled nonlinear functional equations for a wave function of the geometry, so the Schrödinger wave function of the geometry, far too difficult to solve and extremely ill-defined because these are product of two functional derivatives at the same point, which need regularization, and you get back the usual infinities. But it turned out in the late 80s that this equation can be rewritten by changing variables from a metric to a connection. And magically, with a little bit of work, not too complicated, and with taking care of the regularization suitable, is not too hard to show that quantum states defined by a loop in a very simple way as the trace of the line integral of the connection along the loop. This is the holonomy. This is a non-abelian connection. So this is actually there's a path order in front of it. Well, those states solve exactly the Wheeler-DeWitt equation written in this variable, provided that the loop doesn't run self-intersect. Is just a loop in the manifold where the connection of the matrix are defined. That came as a shock, and it took long to understand. Now we understand what's behind it, but it motivated them to sort of use those states to build the theory. Now those states are not really, I mean, the thing is not so easy because for this solution to be satisfied, the loop should not run over itself. And if it doesn't, the actual geometry that it defines is rather trivial. But by using this loop and making things sufficiently complicated, it turns out that this result is the key that makes everything else work. So this is loop quantum gravity, all of it. I have decided to write all the basic equations, not because I'm gonna do in the detailed mathematics of it. This is not the appropriate place for that, but because I want to tell you that this is it's a well-defined theory, like Maxwell theory. You can write the Maxwell equation, general relativity. You can write, the Einstein equation, the definition of gamma, the Riemann tensor, and the geodesic equation. That's it. Or QED. Or QED, you can write just the Feynman rules, the transition amplitudes, and the Fock space creation equalator operator. That's it. That's QED. Then there's a full book of how to use it. But a good theory must be such that you can write the full equations in a single slide. And here it is. And it's defined, this is one version, it's defined in various versions. And this is incomplete, it's without matter. One can do it with matter, with a cosmological constant. But that's the basic version of it, sort of the vanilla version of it, where you have all the key ingredients. There is a kinematical part, a Hilbert space and some operators. I'll say something about the Hilbert space. The operators in the classical limit becomes the metric, becomes Einstein, the Riemann tensor, okay? The tetrad, which is connected to the Riemann tensor. But they form an algebra, a non-commutative algebra. The Hilbert space is basically is inspired by those loop states, is very much the one of QCD on the lattice. It's very similar to QCD on the lattice. You can define this Fock space as a limit, large number of particles. You can define QCD on a lattice and then take a suitable limit. Here, similarly, you can take arbitrary large graph or graph of arbitrary, put together graph of arbitrary shape. And the kinematics is not too different from QCD on the lattice, with crucial differences, which will come in a moment. And then the Hamiltonian QCD on the lattice, so fixed time lattice, sort of, for those of you who know the Wilson-Kogut version of QCD on the lattice. And then the dynamics is given by transition amplitudes from Hilbert space states to others, which are given perturbatively. It's not a perturbation around the metric, but perturbation in a number of vertices, like Feynman graphs, through things called spin forms, which connects this graph, states one to the other. This is called spin network states, via vertices where the dynamics happen. And the dynamics is only in the vertices. That's exactly the content of the fact that until it's only when the loops meet that the Hamiltonian happen. Now, let me say something more about the kinematic and the dynamics, just one slide each, because this is a key point. In the Hilbert space, there's a basis, an autonomal basis, which is called spin network, where the quantum numbers are the graph, the topology of the graph, who is next to whom, some spins associated to links and some integers associated to nodes, which diagonalize operators corresponding to geometry. And more precisely, these V's are quantum numbers associated to the volume of any region, including a node, and the J diagonalize the area of any surfaces cut by these links. And here's the key point. Discreteness is here, only here. These operators have discrete spectrum, and this quantum number are discrete. This is, for instance, the spectrum of the area. J is a half integer, so it's essentially a Planck area times some numbers, which are just 1/2, 3/2, and things like that. This means that there's nothing smaller than the Planck scale, right? The volume, whatever volume you measure, whatever area you measure, whatever phenomena happens, it cannot involve geometry smaller than the scale. This is a result of a spectral calculation. It's a standard. It's like when you diagonalize a Hamiltonian of the hydrogen atom, or when you study angular momentum, right? It's pure quantum mechanics. But since the operator, the field, is a geometry, is quantum mechanics of a geometry. Furthermore, if you take one of this chunk of spaces and you want to think as it was classical, like if you think an electron is a spinning little rock, right? You look at the operators and you discover that the maximum number of operators that describe the geometry of this is less than the number of the dimensions needed for describing the classical geometry of this thing here. So in other words, it's exactly like angular momentum. Angular momentum, you have Jx, Jy, Jz, but you cannot have all three sharps together. That's why an electron is not really a spinning little thing, classical, right? Here's the same. This quanta of space, this elementary quanta of space are discrete, they cannot be too small, and they're fuzzy because they don't have a sharp geometry. You can determine at most some part of the geometry, or you can make a coherent state, provided that they're big enough and you make measurement large enough. So you have discreteness, you have fuzziness, and of course, there's a Hilbert space, a linear space you can put in superposition. This is a beautiful mathematical, cleanly, perfectly clean mathematical description of a quantum geometry, namely Hilbert space and operators that in the classical limit describe a Riemannian geometry. And once again, this is how quantum theory and generativity save quantum mechanics from itself, because obviously now you don't have you cannot have ultraviolet divergences, because when you integrate on intermediate states, there is nothing small. And in fact, if you go to the dynamics, this is dynamics, which was worked out. It took decades to put all this thing together. It took all sorts of people, dozens of people, hundreds of people, I think, when you look at the conferences, all that. So in the middle of the year 2000s, this version of the dynamics was clarified. You can view this as sort of Feynman rules for transition amplitudes for going from one spinetto to another through some intermediate step. So you can view this as a well-defined version of a Hawking sum over geometries. And notice that what the theory allows you to compute is, given an initial state, given a final state, what is the transition amplitude, without any need to go to infinity, because this is general relativity. You can have a compact region of space-time, something which classically would be a compact region of space-time, finite, 2 meters times 1 second, and do the transition here. This is nothing to do with infinity. A couple of comments, because before going to applications, just one comment before going to application. Notice something extraordinarily beautiful here. In quantum mechanics, whatever interpretation of quantum mechanics you use, almost, you always end up having a Heisenberg cut. I mean, in cut CUT, not Schrödinger cut CAT. Namely, see, in Copenhagen, you have a measuring apparatus, classically treated classical in a quantum system, and the cut is a separation between the two. In many worlds, you're entangling two systems, and then this gives the branches, and so some quantities have a value in a branch with respect to the other one. In relational quantum mechanics, you do that explicitly given two systems. That's when values take value, and so on and so forth. So quantum mechanics is deeply relational, whatever you way, almost every way you look at it, because it talks about phenomena, how things manifest to one another. General relativity is relational in another sense. It's relational in the sense of localization. Things are not in somewhere in a fixed background space-time. You don't set that the space-time in your laboratory and then do the theory over it. Localization is relative to the dynamical fields itself, including the gravitational field. So a region is always localized with respect to whatever is around through a boundary. And the beautiful of quantum gravity from this perspective, it works by identifying the boundary of a region with the Heisenberg cut, which means that you always describe a quantum gravity phenomena from sort of the outside. Let's use Copenhagen, which is easier in this. You translate your preferred interpretation of quantum mechanics. So you're outside, you're the observer, something quantum gravity happened, and then you measure again. And the boundary is a space-time boundary. Something about applications. How am I going with time? I have time. I want to reserve the end of the talk to the conceptual consequences of all that. So just 2 or 3 rapid slides about applications. One is to cosmology. It's a huge field. There are thousands of papers, a lot of people working. So I just give the key point, which also go back to the year 2000. If you apply this machinery or similar to quantum gravity machinery to cosmology, what you rather solidly obtain is that the Friedmann equation, this is the Friedmann equation, the equation that governs the scale, the expansion of the universe, is corrected by a term, this term here, which essentially is a pressure repulsion term, which comes in when the curvature becomes extremely high, Planckian. Okay. So this means that if you evolve back in time the universe, if you make a wave packet, a semi-classical state, evolve back in time the universe, instead of following to a singularity, like classical generativity predicts, you have these pressure terms, and the universe bounces back. So this can be interpreted as viewing the Big Bang as the result as a big bounce, a previous universe shrinking down, getting to the quantum regime, getting super compressed, bouncing out. If you take this as the sort of the background universe, then you can do physics over it, and there is a large amount of work trying to see the traces of that in the CMB, in the cosmic microwave background, in the large angle region, and try to connect it with the current sort of anomaly uncertainties and in the between measurement and the prediction of the standard theory without quantum gravity effect. Some people say that, well, there are some indications there, it seems to be working. Other people disagree. There is the usual story in the middle of the fire. But there's a lot of work there, and I think that's where the interest is. At some point, we have to test this theory. The web theory, it's a theory of quantum gravity. It's ultraviolet finite. That gives generativity in the limit. You can put matter. It's consistent with the standard model. But is it right or wrong? We have to test it, and this could be one direction. Another direction is black holes. And black holes, let me do in one slide the story about black holes, because I think there is a lot of confusion in black holes. People identify black holes with event horizons. If this model of black holes is right, there are no event horizon. A star collapses, an horizon forms, so it's standard thing you study in basic generativity classes, but it's a dynamical horizon. It's a parent horizon. It's a trapping horizon. So it's everything that looks exactly, it's the same metric as Schwarzschild or Kerr or Newman, whatever you want. But at some point, it's different because quantum gravity comes in. Why? Well, for sure, because we expect this Hawking radiation. The black hole shrinks at some point. The outside curvature, the curvature outside the horizon, when the black hole is small, becomes Planckian. So you enter the quantum gravity regime. Inside, the curvature certainly becomes Planckian. So certainly you enter the quantum gravity regime. So you can have one of these transitions, which can be computed in loop quantum gravity. There's activity trying to compute explicitly using the transition that I gave you before. And you can find a transition to a classical regime, so tunneling, essentially, classical, quantum classical, to a metric which outsides an exact solution of Einstein equations, which continues on the other side with the trapping horizon becoming an anti-trapping horizon. So the trapped region between an anti-trapped region. So if you want, in simple terms, a black hole becomes a white hole. So all the information that comes in can come out. The von Neumann entropy can be larger than the Bekenstein-Hawking entropy. The number of total state of the black hole is not the number of states you can measure from the outside. It's not the number of states you can measure assuming that this is an event horizon. So up to some point on Scri plus, okay? So there's no page time that forces information to come out with a late Hawking radiation. Information can be stored inside. The black hole is small but very long inside, so to say. It goes, all the information is a white hole. The white hole, all the energy most of the energy has gone out with the Hawking radiation, so you have a lot of information with little energy, so you need a lot of time. So you get a remnant, a small remnant, leaving for a long time from which information can come out. This is a model. It's a possibility. It's a prediction of the theory. Can it be observable? Well, it might be already observed in the form of dark matter. This is one possible candidate of dark matter. That's why I said dark matter is not necessarily an indication that the theories we have are insufficient. Generativity as it is, plus quantum mechanics as it is, giving loop quantum gravity, might perhaps, we don't know. I mean, this is just a speculation, and I'm working on this a lot in these days, might provide remnant of small black holes created in the early universe, and then that have ended their evaporation. They become white hole, or Planck scale, micrograms, so powder in the universe, which would behave exactly like dark matter. There is, in fact, much more, because there's a lot of work, phenomenological, trying to see whether what comes out, either at the moment of the transition or later, in the form of gamma rays, strong gamma rays, or in the form of something that interact with something which interact with something, can be tested. And there are, I don't have time to go to the details, but there are specific predictions of observable effects This curve here, it's a distance frequency relations flattened with respect to the standard redshift of cosmology. That would be observed for photons falling in the black hole and coming out the white hole. The physics here, if I've been a little bit technical here, but the physics here is that if you suppose you go inside the black hole, you tunnel to the white hole, you come out, and your brother stays out. Okay, this is a standard generativistic effect. Your brother becomes much older. It's much less time for you, right? The standard generativistic effect. But this is immense. It can be a microsecond for you and a billion years for your brother. So black hole can be a view as a shortcut to the future. You enter the black hole and immediately you come out a billion years later. Okay, so this was enough for the presentation of loop quantum gravity. I think I've given you an overview, just an idea of what a community of people, a few hundred people working on loop quantum gravity is trying to do. And there are open problems, of course, in the theory, and there are different versions of the theory. There's no empirical confirmation, but there is a theory of quantum gravity, and their attempt to derive consequence. So the last part will be very slow, very fast, very short, I wanted to say. And I want to say what are the conceptual consequences of that. And I'll just fly through this, and let me put them in a half-joking way as quantum gravity's best secrets that I want to whisper in your ear, because that is what I think makes quantum gravity interesting. First of all, there's no time variable in the quantum theory that I tell you. I flash again the equation of quantum gravity. There's no T here. Now, this has created all sorts of debates. When in the 60s, Wheeler-DeWitt equation came out, the Wheeler-DeWitt equation has no T. What does it mean? It means something absolutely trivial and simple. In general relativity, if you have two clocks and you move one, just throw one up and you catch it back, they come back at different time, right? They measure different time. Which one is the right? Which one is the time? Is this a modification of the clock that flies with respect to the true time, which is the one that stays back, or vice versa? By the way, for the physicists in the audience, which one measure less time? Careful. Special relativity and general relativity give the opposite answer. One is right, one is wrong. Which one is right? Anyway, these are two different. This can be measured in the laboratory. Of course, the answer is known is the right time, right? These are two just equally good notions of time interval between the moment in which they were together and the moment they come back together again. So this shows completely clearly that there isn't a single time in GR, time being something you can measure with a clock. Okay, there are many. Between two events, there are all possible proper times between possible curves. So why the hell should we have a time in the foundation of the theory, given that there isn't a time in the observation? What the theory does perfectly consistently is exactly what general relativity does. Namely, there's no preferred time variable, but the theory is predictive because it gives the relative evolution of one clock with respect to the other of any variable with respect to any clock, once you formulate the problem clearly. Two, there's no space. In which sense there is no space? Let's go back to the quanta, the state of the theory. These states are not quanta in space like the photons. The photons, if you think for a moment, the quantum number of the photon is a momentum, polarization momentum. The momentum you can Fourier transform is a position. So the quantum number is where the photon is, okay? Here, the quantum numbers are not where the thing is. There's no where. The where is defined by these things themselves. These are not quantum states in space. They're quantum state of space. They make up space. Space is the thing made by this thing here. So there's no space variable because the quanta are not localized in space. They define localization themselves. Where does the usual space-time manifold GR come from? Well, it's exactly in the same manner in which the electromagnetic field comes out from QED. We don't puzzle. It does. The classical limit, Fock states, can be well described in terms of continuous electromagnetic waves. Now, giving away space and time, allows us to change the basis of the ingredients, the philosopher would say the ontology of physics, which has been evolving since Newton, right? Newton described the world as bodies moving in space as time passes. And then Faraday and Maxwell added the fields, which was not one of the ingredients in Newtonian physics. And special relativity combines space and time in Minkowski space-time. And quantum mechanics, or quantum field theory better, indicated clearly that the particles, the elementary particles, are just excitation of the field. An electron is a quantum of the Dirac field, and vice versa, the magnetic field has particles which are the photons. So we don't have a distinct notion particle fields in quantum field theory. It's just the same thing, different aspect of the same thing, different basis in the Hilbert space, if you want. General relativity tells us that space-time, Minkowski space, is just one of the fields. So space fields and space-time are actually in general relativity merged together in the notion of covariant fields. We don't live in space-time, but live, so to say, on top of one another. Once you go to quantum gravity, you have these quantum fields of it's covariant quantum fields. So you have a single ingredient whose excitations are the quantum space, the electron, the photon, everything. So there's a conceptual unification of ingredients. There's not unification of the forces. You still have to write, a piece of the dynamics for gravity, a piece for electricity, a piece for the strong interactions, a piece for the electrons. Loop quantum gravity has nothing to say about the problem of unification, but there's a lot to say about this, the basic ontology of space-time, of quantum space-time, at the light of what we know about quantum mechanics and what we know about general relativity. You don't need a asymptotic infinity. As I said, you can do everything locally. If you want to compute this, transition black hole, you don't have to go to infinity, like a lot of my colleagues love to do right now. Why? Because they, after all, always assume continuous space-time. So when they try to do things locally in continuous space-time, they get in difficulty because they disregard the fact that the geometry is quantized into small. So you don't need to do asymptotic infinity. In fact, predictions are all local. And let me stretch a bit. There are no things in the sense that what we are actually always translating a problem into, if we go to the general level of quantum gravity, it's a transition amplitude to be called a field configuration on some boundary and field configuration on the other boundaries. So they're processes, events from one observation to the other. But these processes, and that's, I'm going back to the nature of space-time, are not in space-time. And you see, this is not a process in space-time. This is a process that builds space-time. What we call space-time, not in the sense of who's next to who or counting things, but in the Newtonian sense of the space-time described, or in Minkowski sense, that geometry. This is built by the process itself, the quantum process itself. So the processes are not in space-time, they are space-time. And there is no external observer because, as I said, the theory, it's always a piece of the universe described by another piece of the universe. In a sense, quantum cosmology is a large degrees of freedom described in terms of the smaller degrees of freedom that we have. It's not the theory of everything. This is the opposite of the theory of everything. It's a description of the world, how one piece affects another piece of the world. So there's no external observer. You describe nature by breaking always in two. And as I said, I want to repeat, we already have a Planck scale measurement relevant for the Planck scale. No violation of, no breaking Lorentz invariance, supersymmetry, cosmological constants. There are nothing conclusive that indications that nature goes in one, it lacks one direction or not the other. We don't know, but some of the observed phenomena, like happening with black holes, right? The signals from Sagittarius A star, the huge black hole center of the galaxies, were observed since a very, very early day of radio astronomy. Radio astronomy, celestial radio astronomy, was born by observing those signals. Nobody knew that it was a black hole. It took 40 years to understand that it was a black hole. Perhaps dark matter is a quantum gravity phenomenon. Perhaps some cosmic rays that we observe are already quantum gravity phenomena. There are some predictions. I may be wrong. I gave you a curve. There are others, but there are some specific prediction which depend on hypotheses and so on and so forth. So the theory is not just mathematics and theory. It's a conceptual analysis, building up carefully a theory, trying to derive predictions and hoping, comparing with experiment. So this is the list of things I said. There's no time in the sense I said, no space, no asymptotic infinity, no things, just events. They're not happening in space-time, but the process itself, space-time, no service, already measurement, already phenomena, perhaps, and some predictions. And then the last, that's my last slide, the last secret of quantum gravity, I think you get it from my enthusiasm. I think that the best secret is quantum gravity is a horrendously charming problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlo. There's a lot to think about here. We have time for questions and hopefully some answers. And we can start with, I think Carl Merrill has a question. Carl? Are you there, Carl? No, perhaps I'm wrong.
It's muted. It's a P.
Sorry, it took me a minute to unmute.
There you go.
Hi,
First-
Carla.
Yeah, first, I really enjoyed your presentation. I particularly like your writing. I find that very inspirational. I'm not a physicist, but I'm interested in it. So I have two questions. One is, you talked about ultraviolet finiteness, and I wondered, ultraviolet is just part of the electromagnetic spectrum. And of course, there are things that are more finite, if you want, or smaller, such as X-rays and gamma rays. So was there a reason for picking ultraviolet in that context? That's one question. And the other one is, I'm intrigued by the effort to study quantum gravity, the similarity between that and Nima Hamid's development of the concept of the amplitude hadron. That sounds that there's a lot of similarity in these efforts. Could you comment on that?
Yes, with regard to the first question, it's a, sorry, I should have been more clear. It's a terminological confusion. You're right that ultraviolet indicates a certain part of the spectrum, of the electromagnetic spectrum, but ultraviolet is also used in another sense, in a different sense. So it's not in that sense. And since ultraviolet, you know, is a little bit higher frequency that usual light. So ultraviolet is used generically in theoretical physics for meaning high frequency, super high frequency, or super short distance. So I did not mean like the ultraviolet light. I meant as much short frequency as you can imagine, infinitely short frequency. That's where the difficulties of quantum gravity come from. So you pointed out a sort of sloppiness in use of these terms. The second question, the relation with what Nima is doing, is super interesting, of course. And if I wish I could answer. I remember some time ago on the internet, there was somebody having posted a little comic thing in which there was me and Nima talking through different, totally different languages and pretending to say the same thing. I'm not sure. And one of the difficulties of quantum gravity is precisely that people are, you know, taken in their developing, understanding their own direction and don't make enough effort to try to understand what else is going on. Nima is certainly a remarkable theoretician. I wish I understood better what he's doing, really, and also I wish he would pay more attention to try to talk to us and explain and understand how it would connect to what we do. The cultural difference is that he belongs to a world where playing with mathematics, it's believed to be the path, the way ahead, the mathematical problem. I belong to a world where mathematics is, of course, crucial, very important, and you find the right tools and so on and so forth. But the problem is not mathematical. The problem is conceptual. In fact, the difficulty here has been what does it mean to write transition amplitude where you don't have a background space, background time, and so on and so forth.
Since we're asking about other physicists, I have a question from the web. The questioner wants to know what you think about Eric Weinstein's geometrical unity. And I suppose more precisely, where does it fit in with the approaches to unification that you had outlined in yours? Not complete, but illustrative slide showing different communities and little spurs of thinking.
I hope it's not Eric himself asking this question, because
No,
I don't
it's
know.
not.
I don't know how to answer, and and I should apologize to Eric, which I like a lot. I really don't know.
For those of you who don't know Eric, you can look at a former Henry Speaker's blogs. No, name is escaping me. I'm having a senior moment here. Who was it? No, the last Henry Speaker on, oh, I'm sorry. I'll think of it. It's a guy at UCSD who does a show, and you were on the show, but I can't think of his name at the moment. Brian Keating. Right. So for those of you who want an introduction to Eric Weinstein, you can go look at Brian Keating's, I guess they're podcasts or Zoomcasts or whatever, where he talks with Eric. It's very entertaining. And also you've done one. So let me give a little plug for Brian Keating's show. If you like conversations between physicists, it's a nice show to watch. All right, our next questioner is Federica Durema. Federica.
I was waiting for you to unmute. First of all, thank you for your very nice presentation, albeit unfortunately there was a lot of bad connection, so I missed some of what you were saying. And I asked my question a little bit earlier, and so I'm a physicist, nuclear physicist, and in quantum mechanical treatment of atomic, nuclear, solid-state material systems, we solve the Hamiltonian. We truncate the space by, I mean, it typically is an infinite basis states, but we truncate it to have a practical solution for calculating eigenstates, eigenfunctions. In quantum general relativity, not only the dimensions seem to be larger and how that kind of jives with quantum kind of thinking, and then truncating the space would be a much bigger challenge, So what is done to reduce the space? But after you said a few things that there is no time really, is there a Hamiltonian or it doesn't even exist?
Two questions. Let me address one, the first thing and the second. What we do is very similar, is more similar to nuclear physics than what it looks like. Yeah, because in fact, I might even have used nuclear physics as an analogy. You don't use QCD, right? When you do nuclear physics, you don't care about what the individual quarks and the individual gluons do. You have some problem happening at some scale, and you forget about some degrees of freedom. You have some theories. In fact, I don't know which version of nuclear theory you use, but you simplify the problem by ignoring some degrees of freedom, by restricting to something, and then by truncating the dynamics in some appropriate way. And that's an approximation, right? The equations that were in my slides are of the same kind. Namely, you take space-time, you truncate the dynamical equations. You truncate the Hilbert space. In fact, you throw away part of the Hilbert space. You have an evolution. Let me say an Hamiltonian. Then I'll come back to that. and you expand it in a certain parameter, and you compute order by order. So we do the same thing, except that generativity, it's tricky because it has its symmetries, its funny things, and the difference with respect to standard particle physics quantum theory is that the expansion is not expansion in small oscillations around the flat space. Is an expansion in degrees of freedom, which in a sense is more similar to the nuclear physics one than to the standard particle physics one. Now let me come to the Hamiltonian, to the question of the Hamiltonian, because I didn't show the Hamiltonian. I showed transition amplitudes. Instead of giving the Hamiltonian, I could give the unitary evolution operator, which is e to the I Hamiltonian t, or I can give its metric elements, which are the transition amplitudes between some initial state and some final state, if I want to compute transition. Implicitly, this is the general way of computing dynamical thing. For technical reasons that have to do with the specificity of general relativity and the funny way time comes in general relativity, it's easier not to start from the Hamiltonian, but to start from the transition amplitudes. Namely, not to compute things as they evolve in time, but say, given this initial thing and given this final thing, what is the transition amplitudes? And time is in the specification of the initial final data. Because you have to say which time you're specifying, or which clock you're using from going to here to there. So it's just standard quantum mechanics applied to the peculiar physics of general relativity, where time is sort of mixed up with the other variables. But otherwise, it's just Hilbert space operators, eigenvalues, eigenvectors. The spectrum of the area that I gave you is a standard quantum mechanical calculation of a spectrum, and transition amplitudes. But I thank you for having put this question about truncations. All the calculations are not. When I do a black hole of a certain mass that tunnels to another configuration, there are some degrees of freedom which are relevant in that tunneling. I'm ignoring all the others.
Okay, we have a question. I think you addressed some of this, but it may be worth going over it again. Our physicist Scott Matthews asks, what experimental results would constitute evidence for quantum loop gravity? Are there specific cosmological observations and or particle physics observations that would serve as experimental evidence?
No, there is none that has been done which counts as a support for loop quantum gravity, nor for any other current theory of quantum gravity. I insist on that. There is a lot of work trying to do this. In fact, I'm immersed in that. The dozens of colleagues were computing in cosmology, in astrophysics. So all observations are in the sky, because that's where the so there's no direct support. There is theoretical evidence, which is that the theory is it's ultraviolet finite, and it has the right limit. So the theory is not too bad for what we wanted, but that's not sufficient for believing a theory. What counts a little bit in favor of loop quantum gravity is that the competitors are in a worse situation. So it's Larry mentioned that I presented the relation interpretation of quantum gravity as less implausible. I would see loop quantum gravity as so far the less contradicted by nature of the attempts out there, or maybe one of the less. I don't want to say that it's unique.
A related question. You mentioned doing a superposition experiment. And I wanted to know, how would you do the experiment for the superposition of two masses? Gravitational superposition of two masses. You have any?
Yes, this is an idea that was put forward by two groups in the UK, one in London, Sugato Bose and collaborators, and one in Oxford, Marletto and Vedral. It was a paper on Nature and a paper on physical regulators, and then it has sparked a lot of activity. The idea, I'm not an experimentalist, but so I believe what experimentalists tell me that this might be doable, is to take a nanoparticle. And now there's a technology for taking a nanoparticle, splitting it two, like in Stern-Gerlach, but maintaining quantum coherence, so you can just recombine the two things. So you have a single particle in two positions, you have another single particle in two positions, and if you can keep one branch of the one and branch of the other sufficiently close for 1 second, the gravitational effect of one to the other is sufficient to dephase that branch with respect to the others. It's a simple calculations.
Yeah, okay.
And that entangles the two particles. So you go from a tensor state to a non-tensor state. It's extremely beautiful. And once they're entangled, you can check that they're entangled in various ways. One idea was to have a spin particle measure the Bell inequalities, but there are other simpler also. So you prove that it is the actual interaction, gravitational interaction, that has entangled the two. And this is only possible if the gravitational field is in superposition, because otherwise you cannot entangle. There's a theorem in quantum information that says you cannot entangle two quantum systems via mediator, which is classical. So I'm following closely the experimentalists. They say that it might be reachable in a certain number of years. They're working on it.
I have to go read that paper. It's interesting. There's a lot of interesting work being done on macro scale systems where you can observe quantum effects in a way that we couldn't do, 10 or 15 years ago.
Yeah.
So, okay, we have a question from PSW member Charles Huttner. Charles, you can unmute and ask your question.
I really appreciate that. Thank you very much for your lecture. And Brian Keating just came up. It's rather interesting because last week he had on Dr. Lee Smolin, who was talking about the same sort of subject. And one of the things that came out of that is talking about time, is that time is a flow of actions. And one of the things that struck me, and so I'm not a physicist, so you can tell me how wrong I am here, but if you think about light, and it's both a wave, and then when it's observed, it's a particle or in position, could the rest of quantum particles be similar? And that sort of now is described by when we actually observe everything. And everything before that is history, because it's all a bunch of nows, and the future are just waves that follow quantum capabilities.
Lee Smolin, I've made an effort in my slides not to put names, because I should have put too many names that contribute to all that. But if I had to put one name, it would have been the one of Lee Smolin. Many of the key results and have the name of Smolin, and Lee has been one of my main collaborators, both in the early years of loop quantum gravity in the 80s, at the time of the loop state, and then again at the time of the calculation of the spectra in the middle of the 90s. So Lee for me is it's sort of the person with whom I've done what I consider the best physics of my life, plus a extraordinarily good friend to whom I'm very attached. In recent years, He has been deeply concerned with issues having to do with the direction of time, the role of time in nature. How come that things move forward and not backward, and all these kind of things. And so he has been exploring a number of possibility of direction. This is what he was talking about with Brian in that talk. They are speculative ideas. Lise has always been extraordinarily inventive and courageous of trying something completely new and going in directions. And our collaboration has been. I mean, he was the one who was throwing ideas, and I was the one who was trying to say, well, what do we know, what we don't know, what is the right conceptual way of thinking about that, putting things in order, and we still play this role among us. So what he talked with Brian is recent, in fact, ideas of the fundamental role of time. I am more conservative in that. I think that really all our information about fundamental physics is contained in general relativity and quantum mechanics. We don't have to add things to it. Not because general relativity is exactly true and quantum mechanics is exactly true. I mean, maybe there's who knows how much more, but that's the best we know so far.
We have a question from the web. That is to say YouTube. Questioner is anonymous. The question is, how is the propagation of information with multiple paths addressed in loop quantum gravity? That is, how is the resultant determined?
In this loop quantum gravity is just like standard quantum mechanics, in the sense that it does not do something more dramatic than quantum mechanics, but it does not solve the strangeness of quantum mechanics either. So the strangeness of the way information propagates in quantum mechanics, which emerges, for instance, in the sort of APR configuration when you have entangled particles at a distance, you measure one and it seems that information gets to the other one suddenly, but it's not really so because you cannot transmit information and so on and so forth. This kind of mysteries are exactly the same loop quantum gravity. I think, I spent a lot of time in my life thinking about quantum mechanics. I think that having the right take on quantum mechanics might be useful for doing quantum gravity better, but it's not a quantum gravity solves the problem of quantum mechanics. They're independent, fundamentally independent issues. So in the classical limit in loop quantum gravity, information propagates like in classical general relativity inside the light cone and not outside. In the quantum theory, it sort of leaks out in the same way in which it leaks out in non-relativistic quantum mechanics.
I have a question from PSW member Tim Thomas, which I will read. Did I understand you to say that one view of dark matter is that it may be tiny black holes that curve space and hence gravity to change the gravitational forces acting on galaxies?
Half yes, half no. I did say that maybe, and it's a big maybe here because there may be many ifs, but it's an hypothesis that keep fascinating me. What dark matter is indeed teeny black hole, or more precisely teeny white holes, the remnant of the black hole at the end of the evaporation. Does it change the force of gravity? Well, no, it just does exactly the same thing that powder would do. We know that dark matter is well modeled by essentially powder around. The problem is that it's not powder, because if it was powder, we would see it. We would interact it electromagnetically, and it would be baryons, of which we can count how many there are in other ways. So dark matter is something which whose phenomenology is the phenomenology of little things which interact only gravitationally, and that's sufficient for giving. And they're scattered around and with a certain density, and that's sufficient for giving what we see. So they're concentrated around galaxies and so on. And what it is, it's an open question. It could be, I mean, for a while it was fashionable to think that there were supersymmetric particles, neutralinos. So it's a little supersymmetric particles, but this hypothesis has much been disfavored because experiments to detect it haven't detected it, and because we haven't seen supersymmetric particles elsewhere. It could be another kind of particles, or it could be a modification of Einstein equations, but it could just be little things which interact only gravitationally. And we know one: it's black holes, small white holes, stabilized by quantum gravity. So it's a gravitational phenomenon because it's black hole and white holes, but it's not that it modifies the Einstein equations. It just it appears like a component of the energy in Einstein equations, like matter.
Another question from YouTube. Robert Yeager asks, what do we lack in the standard model, general relativity and quantum mechanics, to have greater confidence in the loop gravity formulation? I guess put another way, what does loop quantum gravity give you that you're not getting out of the standard model in general relativity?
Yes, you're right. Thank you, Larry, for for a moment I couldn't make sense. It is very clear. Good. So if you have the standard model, general relativity and standard quantum mechanics, you don't know what happens at the end of the evaporation of the black hole. You cannot do the calculation. If you have only those theories and you want to know what happened at the universe when the density was very high, so the very early universe, you just don't know how to do the calculation. If you have loop quantum gravity, you know how to do the calculation. I mean, maybe it's the wrong theory, but you have a theory that allows you to do the calculation, at least in principle. Then the actual calculation is difficult.
Another question from YouTube. Brian Camelli asks, besides dark matter, what else should we be looking for in evidence of a white hole or the bounce?
As evidence of the bounce, it's in the cosmic background radiation, which is being measured with great precision and with increasing precision in the coming years. One hope is that the application of loop quantum gravity to loop quantum cosmology, in fact, to the early universe, would give us predictions that will be confirmed by refined measurements in the coming years of the cosmic background radiation. Plus, as I mentioned, there might be cosmic rays or other signals from the sky that have properties that could be interpreted as emitted by black holes remnants. So astrophysical signatures, there's a lot of things that we observe from the sky, which is not clear where it come from. Perhaps some of this it's a product of quantum gravity. I view the situation a little bit when we were not sure black holes existed, right? There were signals coming from the sky. Are they black holes? Some people say, no, come on, black holes are not something like real. For long, people didn't believe in black holes at all. And yet some signals already received were obviously radio signals coming from accretion disks of black holes. There's a famous bet between Hawking and Kip Thorne, in which in the 70s, 74, in which Hawking was betting against this being a black hole. He lost.
Another question from YouTube. Your video is frozen, but I guess we can hear you very well. The question is from Jorge Castro, and he asks, can loop quantum gravity compute the entropy of a black hole like string theory does?
Yes, it does.
There you
Okay,
go.
my camera has, yes, it does. And in fact, it was a beautiful story because the first calculation of loop quantum gravity of the entropy of a black hole and the first calculation of the string calculation, which was Strominger-Waffa, came out at a few months distance from one another. So you can compute the black hole, the entropy of a black hole. It's a bit complementary to the one of the in string theory. In string theory, the first one and the easy one, what actually works well, is for extremal black hole. So black hole which are a bit unphysical, they're maximal sort of charge rotation. While the easy calculation loop quantum gravity is for Schwarzschild black holes, for the simple ones. And the interpretation is also slightly different because at string theory, you look from infinity, you count state inside. While in loop quantum gravity, you count surface states of the black hole. It's essentially, you count how many possible configuration of discrete quanta can stay on the surface of the black hole. Which, by the way, it's this interpretation of the black hole entropy that allows the solution of the information paradox, because the black hole entropy has to do with the number of states on the horizon, not the number of states inside. The number of states inside can be much larger.
A question from PSW member Robert Thompson, another physicist. Robert? Hello? You have to turn your microphone on. Here.
Can you hear me now?
Yes?
Okay. Sorry, I didn't have my microphone ready. I was just wondering if there are any, basically any no-go type of predictions that loop quantum gravity has come up with, or the community has come up with. In other words, are there any observational predictions which, if falsified, would rule out loop quantum gravity?
Oh, good. Very good. Yeah, it's a very good question, and the answer is I don't know any. In fact, you know, a good physicist should ask that question before, rather than how I can prove the theory right. It's a beautiful toward the end of Bertolt Brecht play on Galileo, in which Galileo is with his student and they're all excited or something, and the students say, "Oh, okay, let's try now to prove that this is right." And Galileo says, "No, let's prove that this is wrong, and try hard. And if we succeed, if we don't succeed, then we'll be happy that maybe it's right." No, I don't know any. The history of quantum gravity as a search. I mean, quantum gravity started in 1916 when Einstein wrote, "By the way, general relativity is certainly incomplete. It has to be corrected by quantum phenomena." 1916, okay, the year after writing the equations, and then so it's a long history of trying to build a theory that stays together, which is coherent and consistent with the GR, and it has been extremely difficult. So there are some attempts out there. Quantum gravity is not the only one, but it's been so difficult that things that kill the theory theoretical are so many that having a theory that stays together, it's we the theoreticians say, "Oh, good, we have at least one." But you're completely right. The right experimental question is what could either not kill the theory, disfavor the theory. And kill the theory is too hard. I mean, it's rare. Things like SU5, which is killed by proton decay, are rare in physics. Other things that the theory seems to indicate that don't happen. I don't know any, but that's certainly something we should focus more on.
We have another question from YouTube. PSW member Cameo Lance, who's on our general committee, asks, would you please expand on how dark matter may emerge from loop quantum gravity, and can you explain how it's seen in, for example, the bullet cluster?
So there is increasing evidence, but not certainly conclusive evidence, but there's increasing arguments in the theoretical literature in cosmology that in the early universe, there might have been a production of black holes. The reason is intuitively very simple. It was very hot, a lot of fluctuations. When things fluctuate, they may sort of fall in their own horizon. Just by agitating enough, you might create a black hole. And once you have a black hole, it's a black hole. And even if the universe expands, the temperature goes down, now you have the black hole. Now, those black holes might have been small or very small. The story of black holes is that, for long people didn't believe that they were real. Then there were the stellar black holes, Sinus X1, whatever, sort of few solar masses. And then to people's surprise, the big, big quasars, the big galactic black holes come out, which are 1 million times larger, 1 billion times larger. And then with gravitational waves, to everybody's surprise, black holes of 60 solar masses or 40 came out, and there are other possibilities. So we have kept discovering black holes of different sizes. The universe loves black holes of different sizes. So I would doubt that the ones we have seen in the last 10 years are the only ones. Maybe there are others, even bigger or even smaller. So the possibility of small black holes coming out from the primordial universe, it's plausible, and it does not contradict current cosmology. I mean, there are many models, many variations. There's big literature on that, but it's plausible. Now, if these are small enough, they have a good chance to have evaporated via Hawking evaporation and got to the end of the evaporation, namely to when they are Planck scale, which is a microgram. Planck scale, remember, is a little bit less than a microgram. So this point what quantum gravity predicts is not that they disappear at the end. They shrink. They have all the time because they're small, so they shrink in the past. And then what happened? Now, quantum gravity seems to predict that they mutate into a white hole. The inside start coming out, but they remain. There's a remnant. They remain there as a white hole stabilized by quantum gravity, as an object which slowly emits whatever information is inside in the form of photons or whatever. But essentially, mostly, is just a mass which only interacts gravitationally. So if many of these things are around, and the question is that it's cosmology compatible with many of these things was around, this would behave exactly as dark matter. They would cluster, in as dark matter models predict. They would form the gravitational wells in which galaxies form. So the problem of dark matter is can be formulated in this way. If you had something which is very small and interact only gravitationally, then it would justify what we see. What could it be? It's not protons because they interact electromagnetically. It's not this, it's not this, it's not that. Well, it could be white holes, remnants of black holes at the end of the evaporation. It's a model, it might not work because it might not fit with cosmology at the end or whatever, but it's a possibility. Another possibility is that these remnants came from the previous phase of the universe, went through the bounds. So there are these possibilities that dark matter is nothing else that these white holes. And white holes, carefully, are not strange phenomena, are predicted by classical generativity, by the Einstein equations. For 40 years, black hole predicted by the Einstein equations were not taken seriously. Some people do not take seriously white holes, but it could be just a repetition of the stories of black holes.
I'm going to take the last three questions here. Dorema has a follow-up question. So Dorema, you can go ahead and unmute again and ask your question. I'm sorry, Frederica. I apologize for that.
Yeah, hi. I just was going to kind of follow up the discussion about Hamiltonian and your the relation with nuclear physics. And I'm very interested in, are you publishing anything in that topic or in that aspect?
What, on which aspect?
When I mentioned that, you know, Hamiltonian and eigenvalues, eigensolvers for nuclear physics, you said that, you know, there is much more physics with quantum gravity.
No, I see what you're saying. No, I wouldn't know what to indicate specifically as direct connection with nuclear physics. What I was saying is that there is exactly the same gain of truncation and having to identify the right degrees of freedom, the right piece of the Hilbert space where to work, throw away the rest and truncate. So there are some similarity in the general approach to do physics.
So in nuclear physics, we don't know the nuclear force, and actually calculating eigenvalues and eigenstates is kind of not the ultimate test. I mean, you know, you want a higher level moments like electromagnetic transitions, E2, E3s, E4s. And that is where, for example, your truncation of the Hamiltonian space may show that it fails. So is there something equivalent in what you're doing to that? In this case, I assume, you know, you know the force. So how does that help you?
Well, yes, because in nuclear physics, somehow you do know the underlying force. It's just you don't. It's too complicated to use it, right?
Right.
We are confident. We have good reason to believe that QCD is actually pulling the strings, but nobody could compute the atom of iron from QCD. Obviously, the nucleus of atom. You're right. It's here we sort of know the fundamental equations. We believe we know the fundamental equations. And what we have to do is to start from the fundamental equation and cut out the part of the Hilbert space which is relevant. But in this sense, it's easier than in nuclear physics. Nuclear physics, I mean, for the little nuclear physics that I know, I remember from my classes at university, you have to make guesses about what is a relevant Hamiltonian, so to say, isn't it? You have to make models without being capable of deriving it from the hypothetical underlying QCD. Here, there is something like that, because, for instance, in loop quantum cosmology, there is quite a jump from the full loop quantum gravity theory to the dramatically truncated model used by loop quantum cosmology. It's sort of saying, well, you know, from the fundamental theory, we know that this sort of things happen and this should happen. So therefore, in that approximation, we expect a theory that has these properties, and we do that. So this is more similar to, I guess, nuclear physics models. But I don't know how close the analogy could go.
So I think we're going to take one more question from YouTube, and then I think Carrie Liss has a question, and that's it. We need to give our speaker a break here. So the question from the web is really an interesting question. It's why is C the value? It is. Oh, that's Carrie's question. So we have one more question. Why is C the value it is, and why is it conserved across all frames. What's so special about C?
Oh, see the speed of light, you mean?
Yes.
No, the discovery, no, this is a misunderstanding. The speed of light does not have a special value. The discovery in special relativity is that, let me put it this way, the space and time are very much connected to one another. So there is a natural common unit. And historically, we had units for space and units for time, which are different, while we could use the same unit for both. And C just measure the historical discrepancy between the introduction of unit for space and the introduction of unit for time. So it's like, you know, if we lived in a room and we measure the length of the room in feet and the width of the room in meters, and then somebody comes out and say, okay, the ratio of feet to meter is 0.3 whatever. That's a constant that translates width in length. Why is that particular constant? Well, it's that particular constant just because you introduce feet and it's this length of your foot. I mean, the other meters because the French like the meter. So it's completely historical, the value of C. The real physical value of C is 1. Okay, so once you measure things properly, you choose one unit and the other is just determinate. If you introduce the second, the proper unit for measure length is that you send any signal, back and forth 1 second, and that is the unit of length. And so then C is 1.
And with that, let me thank you so much, Carlo, for taking the time to give this talk and for taking so much time to answer questions. It's been a great pleasure to have a chance to meet you and talk and to hear your presentation, which encapsulates the huge amount of work and physics. So I wish I could give you our gifts that we give people when they're here in person. But as you know, you have a rain check for you and a guest to join PSW for any PSW meeting, or if you're not in town for when we have a meeting for a get together outside of the usual meetings. So you just let us know. And
thank you. I look forward for the day I will be there in the city and come in person, and it will be a pleasure.
So thank you so much, and good night. And maybe we'll talk to you a little later. But you can turn off your video and take a rest now.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we're good. Thank you everyone for joining us. The recording of tonight's lecture will be available to everybody on the PSW Science YouTube channel and in due course on Vimeo and via the PSW Science website. Please share the links with your friends and subscribe to the YouTube and Vimeo channel for notifications on new postings, and to PSW on Twitter and Facebook for news and updates on the Society's activities. And join, please join. It's easy to do using the join button on the PSW Science website. Before you go, we have a few important announcements. The 2,443rd meeting, Capstoning the Spring Series, will be on June 18th. The speaker will be Steve Stitch, Program Manager of NASA's Commercial Crew Program. He will be speaking on the U.S. Commercial Crew Program and U.S. and international human space flight. Any changes to the spring lecture series, should there be any, and lectures coming this fall, will be posted to the PSW website. Check there frequently for updates. And with that, let's thank tonight's crew for producing tonight's event James, Ann, Robin, thanks so much. And I will now adjourn the 2,442nd meeting of the Society. To your own private social hours, I wish everyone a good evening.